This is yet another very exciting session we call Power to the People. And in this session, we will learn about the Earth for All report and the power it holds. Let's start by watching this short video. Gaffney, Earth for All Director of Communications, will now start by sharing a presentation of the Earth for All report. It's called 2 Scenarios for the Future. So please join me here on stage, Owen, and let's have you walk through the science and the key findings of the Earth for All report.
Thank you.
You have our full attention.
Thank you, Catarina, and it's fantastic to be here. And our story begins really 50 years ago when we were with the Limits to Growth report. And the Limits to Growth report was a shock to the world. The exponential growth, exponential material use, exponential resource use, exponential pollution would collide on a finite planet. There are limits to growth, and this can be disastrous, catastrophic for humanity. And we're beginning to see some of the signs, some of the cracks emerging. We're seeing them at a planetary scale. We have now exceeded 6 of 9 planetary boundaries that have kept our planet stable for 10,000 years. We're in a danger zone where we now risk crossing tipping points in the Earth system. So this is code red. This is critical for humanity. And now we're seeing unprecedented changes when it comes to the West Antarctic ice sheet, when it comes to the Amazon rainforest, the Greenland ice sheet, the overturning circulation of the Atlantic Ocean. But they're not the only shocks we're beginning to see in the fabric of the planet. We're also seeing economic shocks. You know, the world has never been so wealthy. Yet we face shock after shock after shock, from the financial crisis to the pandemic and now the invasion in Ukraine. There's no resilience built into the system. And then we see a knock-on effect here from into the political system. We're seeing a pullback, a slide back from democracies. We're seeing greater polarization in the world. We're seeing distrust in governments, and it's making it more difficult to make long-term decisions that benefit all. And this is the starting point for the Future Earth initiative. How do we start thinking about economic systems change that provide well-being for all on a stable planet? And the first thing we did with the Earth for All project, we did a global survey on attitudes to transformation. Are people aware of the shocks? Are people aware of tipping points? Do people want to act? And the big conclusion we found is that 3 in 4 people in G20 countries want economic systems change to protect the planet and protect people. So this is an incredible starting point. So our analysis really looks at how we can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals within planetary boundaries this century. What kind of economic systems change will lead to that level of shift? And we already see a lot of thinking and articulation on new economics. We have green growth, we have steady state economics, we have post-growth, we have mission economies, we're looking at things like circular economies and regenerative economies. And really, so there's a lot of new ideas out there, but which ideas are the ideas that are most likely to deliver for most people this century? So this is the critical thing we were looking at. And to do that, we created a Transformational Economics Commission of about 40 leading thinkers in economic systems change, both when it comes to poverty, inequality, but also energy and biodiversity and valuing nature, bringing them together for this 18-month process to think through it. But what we also did is we brought together some of the world's leading system dynamic modelers and created a model that could also do some real novelties, including planetary boundaries in the model, including a finance sector in the model, including the ratio between workers and owners in the economy and wages. We also included a well-being index and a social tensions index to look at how the global economy can evolve this century in a sustainable manner. So, and we split the world into two scenarios. What's, the first one, too little, too late. What if we just keep on doing what we're doing? What if we are sort of making incremental progress on climate change? What if we, incremental progress on poverty? Where does that lead us? But what if we take a giant leap? What if we make huge investments? What if we change our economic system and drive much greater change than we've seen before? Where does that leave us? And then we looked at we imagined 4 girls being born in 2020 in different parts of the world. What would happen to them over the course of this century? How would their lives potentially unfold? So number one, we found that business as usual will bring us to beyond 2 degrees, beyond the Paris Agreement. We face catastrophic risks if we push along this trajectory. We come very close to tipping points. We could indeed cross tipping points when it comes to West Antarctic ice sheet or the Amazon rainforest. So these are risks we're taking. And of course, we will have increasing mega floods, mega droughts, and extreme events in the world. So this is a very, very unpleasant future environmentally. But the other thing we found is that if we continue business as usual, quite logically, then we will have rising social tensions in the world and make it more difficult to solve some of these problems because the growth in wealth will be, as it has been for many decades now, it grows faster than the economy. And so you'll always have this ever-widening division, and we know that greater inequality in the world has a destabilizing effect. It creates elites and the rest. And we can see this is one of the problems in the world for dealing with these sorts of challenges. But the other thing we found is that collapse is not inevitable. In fact, we can avoid that. We can actually achieve well-being for all of 9 billion people or so within planetary boundaries. And this is one of the key positive conclusions, but it will take 5 extraordinary turnarounds to achieve this. So this is, energy is the most obvious one, and food systems change where we need to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases to around 0 by 2050. And when it comes to food, we need to completely change our food system to pull down carbon, to eat healthy diets, and to reduce food waste. But the critical thing is we need to do much more than that. We won't achieve the energy security and food security unless we also end poverty, and unless we also provide 100% gender equity in the world, and unless we also deal with the inequality crisis. Because without dealing with them, we will not have the foundation to bring everybody on board on this remarkable transformation we need to make. The other thing we found was that this is easily affordable. It would cost about 2 to 4% of global income for the energy transformation and the food systems transformation. Just bear in mind, we found 10 trillion very quickly to deal with the pandemic, 10 trillion and counting. And this is less than that. This is about $2 to $4 trillion a year for this kind of transformation. So it is affordable. But we need to prepare for disruption. This will be a disruptive journey. So again, the solutions need to bring everybody on board, or they will be rejected. And this will take active governments. All the key solutions means we need to change how the market operates. We need to, and we need long-term planning. We need long-term infrastructure investments. And for that, we need much, much more active governments than we're seeing today. And ultimately, we need to redistribute wealth to create that social trust to go on this journey. We say that the wealthiest should take no more, the wealthiest 10% should take no more than 40% of income, similar to the Nordic countries. This is far from some full equality, full utopia, but we believe this is a workable level of inequality for to drive the kind of agenda, the kind of transformations that we desperately need. The good news is, though, we are coming close to the kind of level of action we need. We are close to tipping points, but positive tipping points, social tipping points that push us in a new direction. And this is because in the last few years, we've seen the rise in social movements around the world. We've seen greater political momentum, greater political action in this space with Green New Deals and green civilization, ecological civilization ideas coming from China and elsewhere that are really pushing this agenda, responding to the social movements. And we're seeing the economic logic moving towards sustainability. It's becoming far more affordable. It's the default option, the cheapest option, is now increasingly becoming the most sustainable option. And we're seeing great innovation in technology. But finally, how do we get moving on this? How do we really start accelerating this change? And we believe one of the key things is power to the people. We need citizens' movements to start really mobilizing and engaging and building that trust. And we think citizens' assemblies on economic systems change. This is their moment. This is a moment to bring citizens together, to unite around this common agenda, to try to reduce some of the polarization and come together with common solutions for all. So, to finish then, we have these are just a preview of some of the findings from Earth for All. We will publish the book in September in advance of the UN General Assembly. We have the website, earthforall.life, and follow us on Twitter. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Owen. Excellent, excellent presentation, and your work is extraordinary. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So it's now my pleasure to reintroduce, because she has been here before, Sandrine Dixson-Declève. She's chair of the Club of Rome, and she is an international and European climate, energy, sustainable development thought leader. And Sandrine, you're with us here on Zoom. Wonderful to see you again. So I'd like to start by asking you, what are the key policy recommendations that have been coming out of the Earth for All report?
Thank you so much, Catarina. I'm pleased to be back again. And I wanted to build on Owen's great presentation, because really, if we look at 50 years ago and the limits to growth, and we look at where we are today, we know that we are now very much in the midst of the crises that were predicted already in that seminal report. And so what we wanted to do together as scientists and economists, which is why we set up this transformational economics panel, but also why we were very, very strict about also looking at a system dynamic modeling spectrum so that we could address all of the interrelationships between policies. This really did lead us, as Owen said, to these 5 extraordinary turnarounds. So for us, if we're going to look at policies, we need to address poverty, inequality, empowerment, and then the energy and the food system together. And this is what probably we didn't say enough, actually, in 1972, and probably hasn't been really emphasized enough since, which is that we need to think both of the new economic metrics that we needed in our economic system. So moving beyond GDP and ensuring that we look at new indicators to growth, or what we call real human development indicators. But while we make that the center of our policy making, we then have to ensure some of those very important points that Owen has brought forward are taken into account so that we can enhance well-being in the planetary boundaries. So that means that governments need to have clear missions. And that means that, in fact, this week, we're also calling on many of the governments to stop making new pledges, but at least go forward with the pledges that we've had before. For example, the 100 billion on climate that we called for, or others that we very much have asked for in the past, such as cutting greenhouse gases by 50% every decade to reach net zero by 2050, or new calls that we put forward and that we heard coming out on agriculture around regenerative and sustainable agriculture and ensuring that actually all of our land is transformed to regenerative agriculture. So these are some of the key policy asks that we have. But then we go into much more detail. And I think where it gets exciting is looking very closely at, for example, expanding the fiscal policy space, looking at the way in which debt is really creating a huge problem for our low-income economies. How can we cancel that debt? How can we ensure that GDP, or at least new indicators to growth, are properly transformed in those economies so that well-being is actually enhanced? How do we look at trade regionalization? High-income countries need to start looking at local protection of fledgling industries differently and ensuring that actually we're having a north-south balance in terms of our trade relationships. Or, for example, new development finance, looking at the way in which we work with the International Monetary Fund to allocate over $1 trillion to low-income countries and special drawing rights. Clearly, part of this is also progressive taxation on the wealthy. And we're seeing that this is really a key issue that we need to address. We have to start putting a tax on the 10% richest of society. We saw last week, I was at Davos, hence where I got COVID, by the way, that in Davos, there was even a declaration by many of the wealthiest billionaires who are indicating that it's time to actually put a tax on the wealthy. So these are some of the key points that we are really calling for. And we know very clearly that we have to reform our international financial system, our trade regulations, but also our economic indicators to start to really underpin a shift.
Thank you, Sandrine. This is all very complex. This is so complex. So how do we make sure that the leaders, the policymakers, actually prioritize in the right order and make sure that this diverse pool of problems and solutions are addressed in the right order, if there is a right order?
So, yeah, very good question. And I think that the right order is to start to dig deep into some of the perversities that are already existing in our market. You know, for example, we've been also in our policy recommendations indicating very clearly, let's work also around where are those subsidies that need to be eliminated or shifted? For example, the current subsidies that we have on fossil energy and the current subsidies that we have on agriculture, industrial agriculture in particular. How do we shift our budgets? Where can we start to put in place in our national government budgets a really value-based system that is starting to place a value on nature and placing a value on people? This also means that we need to look at our taxation structures. And actually, we have seen some of these shifts in the past, shifting our taxation on labor to products, putting a penalty on dirty products rather than clean products. And I think that one of the key areas as well, which is most exciting for us, which we've really tried to show as, I would say, one of the key novelties that we would like to promote through this campaign, is to look at universal basic dividend. And how can we actually do that and build up citizen funds so that we can redistribute wealth and ensure that we are truly creating more well-being for all?
Sandrine, you were supposed to have been here today, and you, well, unfortunately, struck by COVID. You look very well, by the way, so we're happy, not very ill.
Thank you.
So anyway, but today the Earth for All team presented the report. And I'm sure you have gotten reports back from the team how it was received. So please give us your conclusion of the reception of the presentation today.
Very well received, and actually we also presented it in Davos last week, and again received an excellent reception. I think the reason why the reception is so positive is that we're really trying to address this in a variety of different ways. So one is, how can we bring more scientists on board to ensure that they're integrated as we move through this system dynamic model and continue to update the model so that we can give the right analysis to governments. From an economic perspective, how can we bring more new economic thinking on board and economists who can truly work with governments in order to look at new indicators to growth? And I mean, this is not a novelty in terms of looking at new indicators. We have the well-being governments that are already going far ahead, and we heard them this morning, in fact, at another event that we had. But in addition to that, we have local communities that are adopting the donut model. And then third and most excitingly, how do we bring citizens on board? And I think that is the third pillar of this campaign that is so fundamental, because we don't want to be bogged down just in the science or the economics and not be able to translate this to a broader audience so that people feel that they can be part of the journey and not just this is about sacrifice. And I think that's incredibly important. So far, we've received real positive reactions. But now the key, and this is what I have been saying time and time again, is to make sure that governments start to take this information and act, that we don't come out of Stockholm with just a bunch of other pledges and not actually some definitive action.
Enough with the pledges.
Yes.
Bring on the action. Well, thank you so much, Sandrine, for joining us. And I'm happy you look so well. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now we move on. We have another exciting and very distinguished speaker with us here, Jayati Ghosh from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She's an economics professor and member of the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism, which provides pathways for international cooperation to deal with current and future challenges. So please join me here on stage, Jayati. Wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure
Please
to
stand
be
here
here
next to me.
Sure.
So, in terms of inequality, it is at the heart of climate change, of course. How do we reduce it? It's key, isn't it?
It's absolutely key. In fact, you can't do any of the other turnarounds unless you reduce inequality. You can't reduce poverty. You cannot do the energy transformation. You can't do any of the social goals, really, without reducing inequality. But particularly for climate, I just want to emphasize that, actually it's not the number of people on the planet that's responsible for the mess we're in. It's the rich. We know that countries that have 14% of the world's population today are responsible for 80% of carbon emissions historically. Even with the Glasgow pledges, they're going to be responsible for 60% of carbon emissions till 2050. So that's unequal already. But what's now even more devastating is if you look at just the top 10% of the world's population. Half of them are in North America and Europe, about 20% of them are in India and China. But that top 10% is responsible for nearly half of carbon emissions. And so that's really what we have to bring down. If we could reduce their emissions per capita to just the level of the European average, that's all, and that's already high, right? If we could bring it down to just the European average level, we would reduce global emissions by 1/3. So obviously we have to look at the rich. And it's many of the things that Sandrine already mentioned. Certainly we have to do a wealth tax, because now the wealth inequalities are just obscene. But first we have to identify the wealth. We don't even know where it is. So let's have national wealth registers, asset registers where we try and identify who owns what, how much, and where have they stashed it in different parts of the world, so that then countries can follow up and actually trace that wealth and tax. Even a tiny taxation would help.
And now, because lots of money is just stowed away and never reaches the government taxes.
Absolutely,
system.
that's the point. And they can do that because there is so much opacity, because we simply don't know. And in fact, the governments where they do stash it, we don't have lists of the beneficial owners of trusts. Now, when they're trying to go after Russian oligarchs, they suddenly realize, well, we don't know how much they have because it's all in trusts that are not named. So find the beneficial owners, make these lists, and make it available for all these governments and for taxpayers to actually get the benefit of some taxation on that wealth.
It's a very straightforward suggestion that should be able to be implemented.
All we need is political will, which is not available, apparently. So that's one. But, obviously we need huge investments. And we're going to need them for climate, for the energy transition, for the food transition, but also just for meeting the minimum basic needs of half the world's population, which still doesn't have that. And we know that there's massive fiscal imbalance. You know, the rich countries spent trillions. We just heard 10 trillion, 11 trillion for the pandemic. The low and middle income countries maybe spent less than $500 billion altogether because there just wasn't that fiscal space. Another big reason is because multinational companies don't pay their taxes. They shift the taxes around different jurisdictions, wherever it's cheaper or wherever the tax rate is lower. And that's, again, something you can deal with. You can say, we're going to treat you as one company and we will tax our share of your global profits. The trouble is that the attempts to do that, which is a very obvious and simple solution, were basically taken over by corporate lobbies. And so the so-called solution that we have with the OECD is no solution. It's reducing the whole thing to a joke. It's a farcical, small amount that will be redistributed. But if there was enough pressure, we could actually demand a proper solution so that at least multinational companies pay the same tax rate as domestic companies. So that's all.
You are putting this pressure on the decision makers. Who else needs to be in this game?
Everybody else. That's the problem. It can't just be a few economists, a minority of economists saying this. It has to be people. Because everybody's losing out. Citizens of the world are losing out, while a few very small number of large corporations in basically 5 sectors is, laughing all the way to the bank.
So they dodge the taxes and it makes people filthy rich so they can pollute more.
Absolutely.
On the expense of future generations and people in more poorer straits.
Yes. And in fact, the pollution emissions of the top 10% have increased in the last decade. They've come down for the poor, the bottom half of income distribution, even in North America and Europe. They're actually emitting less, the top 10% are emitting more, and we are letting them.
So coming back to the inequalities, which inequalities trouble you the most? This is obviously one, the rich are getting richer and dodging taxes and everything, but there are other inequalities.
I would say, if I really had to, there used to be that slogan of the Occupy movement, right? It's the 99%. I would say it's big capital against the rest of the world. And we see that now when, food and fuel prices are rising globally. Who are the beneficiaries? It's big pharma, it's big oil, it's big energy in general who are benefiting, and it's big finance. And we now have the other big gainer of the Ukraine war, big military companies, big armaments companies. They are the gainers. Their profits have exploded in the last 6 months. When everybody else is suffering with higher food prices, higher fuel prices, and all kinds of inability to even meet your basic meals a day. These companies are raking it in. Their profits, in some cases, have doubled or tripled. It's the highest historically recorded.
In my sense, after being on the stage here interviewing people for almost 3 days now, and prior to that, and many, many occasions for years, I sense that there are companies that are actually powering up and understanding this, that there is sort of a movement here. Do you disagree? Is it too late? Obviously, it's not enough, but there are companies.
Okay, let's be clear. I'm not saying companies are good or bad or moral or immoral. What's the purpose of a company? To make profits. What will they do? They will respond to the thing that gives them greater profits. Where it helps them to tell people we're trying to do what we can and we're good, they will do that. But our job is not to say, oh, please be good. Our job is to bring in regulations that make sure they do the good thing. So Sandrine mentioned subsidies. The IMF has estimated that total subsidies on fossil fuels in 2020 was $5.9 trillion. $5.9 trillion, nearly $6 trillion. The total climate finance of public, private, everybody put together, IPCC estimates 640 billion. Okay? The climate finance going to developing countries, 80 billion.
It's a drop in a bucket.
80 billion. I mean, really, obviously, it's a no-brainer. I mean, the markets are skewed by subsidies in favor of fossil fuels, right? So, number one, we have to shift those subsidies away from fossil fuels to green energy. But also, we have to regulate. We have to tell, financial companies, Blackstone and everybody, if you put $100 into fossil fuels, you have to put $500 into green energy.
So how do we get this in place? Because we need brave politicians, right? We need politicians with courage, with vision, that actually are brave enough to implement these.
And we need public pressure. So even the most visionary politicians can't do this unless they can see the groundswell of pressure from below.
And then we bring in the consumer pressure and the voter pressure.
public pressure in general. Because, you know, something like a regulation, there is no consumer pressure per se. It has to be major public movements in which the politician will have to say, why is he not or she not bringing in this regulation? It doesn't even cost any money. A simple regulation saying you cannot do this. Or if you do, you have to invest that much more in something else.
So, final question to you. Call to action for politicians, a short one, please. Fire away.
Stop thinking of the short term. Think of survival of the planet and the people, and recognize that you can't do it unless you actually do the policies that benefit people rather than profits.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we move on. We have another fantastic speaker lined up here for you. Elizabeth Wathuti. She's founder of the Green Generation Initiative in Stockholm. So please join me here on stage, Elizabeth. I'm so happy for this session. I have so many fantastic speakers just coming up to me here on stage. It's such a blessing. So Elizabeth, you do a lot of work with local communities on the ground in Kenya. And I'm not sure everybody knows what that work entails. So could you please start off by telling us what you do?
Definitely. I think one of the most important part of my work is working with communities, and especially those on the front lines of the climate crisis. And I've spent the past few weeks really explaining to people how the climate crisis is a reality in communities like mine back in Kenya that's most impacted. And just a few weeks ago, I visited a particular community that's in Wajir, a county in northeastern part of Kenya. And this is a county that's greatly impacted by the drought situation that has affected parts of northern eastern Kenya and also parts of the Horn of Africa. And we know right now we have over 3 million Kenyans and over 20 million people in neighboring countries across the Horn of Africa that are facing climate-related starvation. And this is because this prolonged drought has continued to cause consecutive rainy seasons to fail. And so being able to spend time with these communities, listening to their stories, and even seeing how the crisis has impacted them, because for instance, for this community, they depend on 80% of their livelihoods. It comes from their livestock. But every time I walked through the streets and every time I walked through this community, I could see hundreds of livestock dying or already dead. And I kept asking myself, how will this community really continue to survive, and how will we tell this community to adapt to losing their livelihoods, to losing their cultures, to losing what they call home and losing what they call a livelihood for themselves and their families. And for me, seeing such stories and even meeting and hearing from parents who've had to pull their children out of school because they don't have any other source of income, and also seeing people who are losing hope for the future that's not promised, because right now they're counting losses, they're counting all these damages at the moment. And also what is really important to me from these communities is how they're trying to build resilience. Because despite being the most impacted, I remember speaking to one of the people in this community and telling me how they've prepared land, they've dug, ready to grow crops. But again, the rainy seasons have continued to fail. So they're trying every way possible to earn a living, but also this challenge is a big problem. This challenge is about what is happening elsewhere beyond their borders, and they are not aware. So it's these stories and these experiences that I've seen with my own eyes, heard with my own ears, that compel me to use my voice to speak for these communities, to let people know what is happening back at home, but most importantly, to let people know that these communities have not just chosen to be victims, but they're running solutions every day, but they cannot do it on their own. We have to make certain, clear, drastic, and concrete changes around the world to make sure that these communities have got their lives and livelihoods in space, because they deserve a future. The children in that community deserve to have a decent future, and they're not responsible for the crisis. So the best that we can do is to push for urgent action, but really begin to tell these really important stories and not just listen to them, but actually be moved to take urgent action, because these communities depend on the decisions that leaders make today. But also what really makes this really important is the fact that these voices need to be in the rooms where the decisions are being made, because they are not going to get a living or their lives out of decisions that are going to be made, that are going to happen in the future. They need action right now. And that's why it's really important that we allow their voices to be heard.
Well, thank you for being such a strong voice in this. This is really, really crucial. I understand that. So, Elizabeth, in terms of systemic change, even if this is urgent right now in the communities that you visited, we also need to change the entire system. Of course, this is all interconnected. So, which are the biggest hurdles, from your perspective, to this huge systemic change that we need to see?
I think one of the main hurdles is the fact that we are so much disconnected from the realities of the world and how our actions today are impacting communities. Because this is not about numbers and charts. It's beyond what we are hearing from the science. It's about how we put that into human stories, how we actually humanize the climate crisis and tell these stories of people who are impacted. But again, we have not allowed ourselves to connect with how our actions today are impacting communities, because this is a human problem. This is about the human heart. It's about the human mind and how we put these communities in our hearts and in our minds as we make the decisions. And secondly, the other challenge is that we have had so much personal vested interests, whereby the leaders will come on international stages, say one thing, and then do another thing back at home. So it's about broken promises. It's about pledges and commitments that have been made but have not been fulfilled, because we are not lacking science, we are not lacking information, we're not lacking innovations. We have all these things in place, but we need to keep asking ourselves, why is it that things are still not changing? It's because we're still stuck with pledges that have been made and not met. And I think this is still continuing to cause these lives and livelihoods of these communities to be really affected, because the science has continued to be clear, and we know that things are only going to get catastrophic for communities like mine if nothing is done. It's going to mean more frequent floods and droughts. It's going to mean more natural disasters, more that are even to an extent where the humans cannot be able to adapt to. And we've had all these things, but still we know that we need to move faster. And for instance, every day we know that we need to end our deadly reliance on the fossil fuels, but also make sure that our investment flows are moving more into renewable energy that allows access to clean energy for all and not just to a few who can afford it. So all these things also tie into our economic systems, because I like to call it a sort of economic system that is allowing us to really take more from nature than nature can actually regenerate herself. So we have to change all these systems, our global food systems as well. How are we treating nature? How are we making sure that we're regenerating nature, but at the same time making sure that our existing ecosystems continue to stay intact? And I think all these things are only going to be made possible if we actually say what we are going to do, if we tell these really important and possible stories and not just say them, but actually do it, because the pledges, the commitments, and all these things that we're hearing from the leaders are not going to give food and water to the people or to the children. It's only going to make things worse. But again, if we take the step of actually doing it right now without waiting, because the impacts are not waiting, they're impacting them right now, then I think that's how we can be able to overcome this problem. But again, it's a human problem. We have to take it in ourselves to allow ourselves to understand how we're making the situations difficult for people who are affected by the crisis right now.
So, Elizabeth, are you a pessimist, or do you have some sort of optimism towards the future?
I have for many times said that I do believe in the human capacity to care deeply and to act collectively, but only if we allow ourselves to feel it in our hearts, definitely. And so what is really most important for me is the fact that the reason I'm speaking out, the reason I'm saying these things is because I know that we can turn things around, but we have to keep pushing. We have to keep reminding people what is happening back at home. We need to keep reminding people that action can actually not wait. And if I did not believe in these things, then I wouldn't be pushing for people to really take urgent action, because I also believe that we can be able to really change things. We can be able to make things different. We can be able to be compelled to take action if we allow these stories and if we allow ourselves to listen. And back then, I used to talk about the crisis of listening and feeling, because if we do not listen to frontline communities, we're not going to feel how our actions are affecting and impacting them. And that means we are not going to be compelled and moved to take action. So we have to solve this human problem in a human way as well, and then make sure that we are not allowing vested interest or allowing anything to stop us from saving the people who are actually on the front lines as well, because we know that even no money can help these people get back what they have lost. So we have to keep reminding ourselves that this means a lot to people right now whose lives and livelihoods depend on the decisions that we're making every day. So it is possible to turn things around, but we cannot wait too much, because waiting too much means it's going to be more catastrophic for the community like in Wajir County that I've mentioned. And that's just one example of how the climate crisis is impacting many people. I know there's so many communities all around the world that are impacted, but we cannot forget about these communities if we want to move things right now.
There is a disconnect, obviously, but you are extraordinary in making this connection stronger. So thank you very much for your work and for sharing your stories and for being the spokesperson of the frontline communities in your part of the world.
Thank you so much.
Excellent work and very important work. Best of luck.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Strong witness from the frontline communities here. As you can tell, I'm a bit shook up here. We have another speaker here. She's with us via Zoom, Claire Mellier from Global Assembly, and she's joining us here just behind me. There you are, Claire. Wonderful to have you with us here. And you're an expert representing the Global Assembly. And could you please tell the audience what is Global Assembly and what you have tried to achieve last year that led up to the COP26?
Thank you. Owen introduced earlier the concept of the Citizens' Assembly and how it could lead to change. So the Global Assembly was the first time the Citizens' Assembly model was taken to the global level. And we initiated it back in 2020, and we designed a process that brought together a snapshot of the human family. So for this year, which was a prototyping year, we got 100 citizens from all around the world who were selected by what we call sortition, which is basically a civic lottery, which gives everyone a chance to be selected. And the 100 citizens were representative as best as we can with 100 citizens. You know, we're not claiming statistic representation, but we had a diversity of profile. And just to give you an idea of who was involved, we had 50% women, 50% men. 70% of the assembly members earn less than $10 a day, which is, you know, the average globally. And we had a question on attitude as well. So we knew that based on the UN survey, we knew that 32% of the global population doesn't believe that climate change is an emergency. So we had that sample. So we had that diversity, and we brought together these assembly members online on Zoom, and we took them through a learning journey and the deliberation journey. And they presented their declaration at COP26 in Glasgow on the 1st of November in one of the biggest Green Zone event in Glasgow. So that was just in a snapshot what we tried to do with the Global Assembly last year.
So, Claire, do you really think that? Well, do you think really is not the right word here? Do you think that the citizens' participation that you just showed an example of can really lead to the change we need to address these multiple crises that are really interconnected?
Well, at the moment, what we're saying is that the climate and ecological crisis is a result of our governance crisis, and that's what we've heard from Owen, from Sandrine, from Jayati, and Elizabeth. Is we've got our political leaders who are not taking the decisions that need to be taken because they don't feel they've got the public support. But what these citizens' assemblies are doing is that they are showing actually that citizens are ahead of politicians. And what's happening is that the model of citizens' assembly at the moment is consultative. So political leaders can then do whatever they want with the outcome from these processes. And we've seen that in France, for instance, with the Convention citoyenne pour le climat, which was probably one of the most high-profile assembly we've seen so far. And the climate bill that came out of this process was a watered-down version of the recommendation that came from the Convention's recommendation. So the message I'm trying to get across is that I think these processes, these assemblies, have the potential to lead to transformative change. What's been missing is the agenda setting. So currently the framing of these assemblies is determined by the political commissioning bodies. But what we have found out, especially for me, that was the most eye-opening moment. It was with the Convention citoyenne, where the assembly members themselves, at the beginning of the process, before they had ever even heard from experts, they came up with barriers and levers and blockers of change. And I'll just read you one sentence. It was in French originally, but I translated it. Their statement was, the obsession with growth, GDP indicators, and the logic of profits is a blocker to the transition. The logic of financial interest takes precedence over the common interest. So even before they heard about the climate crisis, they realized there was a systemic problem with the model that we're operating with. Unfortunately, the process was not designed to support deliberation on this issue of transformative economics, post-growth, degrowth models, etc. But I think the citizens actually are ready for this. And it's, Owen mentioned the survey that they did in the G20. And so it's, in a way, it's about, we need to create this new narrative in the same way as we need to create this movement where people realize that the current model of decision-making is broken. And especially for the newer generation, it's common sense. We need to move away from this current model of decision-making. I think we need also to have new narratives around these new economic models. When you talk about degrowth, for instance, to someone who live on $10 a day, this is really hard to stomach. So it's about, what does degrowth mean, or post-growth means in our countries, the OECD, the G20 countries, for instance. And so there's a big, important work that we need to do around narratives, I think, and how we tell the stories about what could be possible.
Claire, you might say that 2021 was sort of a prototyping year for this assembly. What sort of innovative processes were the most successful, and what can you build on?
So we learned a lot, and we've got a group of 30 researchers from all across the world who are evaluating our work at the moment. So we'll have a report and evaluation, but we know already that what works is that we know we can bring citizens from around the world with different views, different values, belief system together to hear from each other and come up with, a declaration that you can read on the Global Assembly website, which is really powerful. We had, 41 languages, so we had to deal with, multiple translation. We had people who were completely illiterate, so we we managed to address all these challenges, and we looked at not just the climate crisis, but also the ecological crisis. So that was, I think, a big, an innovation in that sense, because often these assemblies separate the climate from the ecological crisis. And Bob Watson, Professor Bob Watson, was former chair of IPCC, and IBES was actually the chair of the Knowledge and Wisdom Committee of the Global Assembly. And so from the start, it was very strong that we needed to address these issues together. So we've made, huge innovations. I think we need to just acknowledge that these processes are actually coming from the West, and they're rooted in deliberative democracy ideals, which are actually global North ideals. And so how do we decolonize these processes? And we just need to be honest with the fact that there are values in the processes we design that need to be surfaced. So I think that's one of the biggest learning, is how do we bring, the deliberation at the global scale, and address, decolonization, our extractive, capitalistic model, and just acknowledge, what are embedded values in everything we design, really, and be really reflective.
Well, fascinating work and important work. Thank you very much for sharing your insights here, Claire Mellier. And best of luck with your continued work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, to give us a summary, we have with us Luca Miggiano. He's campaign leader at Earth for All. So Luca, please join me here on stage and summarize the session we have just taken part here and today next to me here, please. Join me. Such excellent speakers, colleagues of yours, huh?
Yeah, it's pretty difficult to summarize. I can say some messages. So the first one for me is really important, is a big message that we can actually reshape our economies. We can reprogram our economies, and that is possible and is doable. And Earth for All is a credible plan to do that. Of course, I already read the book, who's going to be published in September. And what is really striking there is something that has been said in this panel already, is basically it's a way to address the two major challenges of our time, the inequality crisis and the climate crisis, and do it in a way that the solution works for both of these crises. There's a lot of research and modeling work behind that, and then a big call to action for governments. What Sandrine and Owen and others said, for governments that can do these things, can actually invest in this kind of in these 5 turnarounds. But to do that, they need really to focus, to have a mission on these turnarounds. And I think the other point across all the interventions today was that we have to have honest conversation about these things. Also here, of course, but in official gatherings with governments, talking about economics when we talk about environment, when we talk about the climate change, be open to talk about redistribution of wealth. And then one other element which I really liked is that all the panelists were talking about the need to manage the transition, the transformation, politically and socially. Some very strong ideas to be debated, like the citizens' funds, for example, and then very strong words on participation. We heard from the power of movements. We know all that we are here in a different situation from 5-6 years ago because of movements, the climate movement, the women's movement, the fighting inequality movement. We need to keep the pressure up for governments, to create the space for governments to lead. We heard very strong words about the need to hear the frontline communities, to give space to indigenous peoples, those that actually suffer the most from the impact of climate change, those that suffer the most from poverty and inequality. And then I think the last part from Claire is again about ownership and participation. So these major transformations need the ownership of people. And the assemblies, the citizen assemblies are a very good way to do that, to bring along people with their creativity and ownership. And so, if you connect all these things, in what is, I think, a very credible and doable plan. I mean, Owen told that it's an affordable plan too, which is Earth for All. That's what excites me and what I think is a good summary.
Thank you very much, Luca. You were part of the presentation, both the committee that presented here today earlier. What did you feel after the presentation? Well, how was it received?
The presentation today morning? As Sandrine said, there's a lot of interest because it's a plan, it's a vision that is doable. So what we have now is in general in the debate is a lack of imagination, I think. It's a lack of ideas. And this Earth for All is actually vision, a plan that can be implemented. But of course, you need political will, and you need to be governments to be leading this change, and you need public support to allow governments to do that. So there's a lot of interest, but it's also, it's also about starting a conversation about how to change the economies. So not all the solutions are in the book, of course, but it's about being able to discuss certain things that were not discussed. Economy is not a given. The way we structure the economy is not a given. We can think about other ways, and I think that's even more important. Also to allow, because of course every country has its own path and its own history, its own background. So that's, I think, is very important.
So Luca, what is the next step for Earth for All now?
So I think I just want to say the first one is just to talk about it, to have these conversations, not just here, but in official gatherings. For example, here in Stockholm, not just having a Ministry of Environment, but finance ministries, Minister of Development, prime ministers, talking about the inequality and climate change together. We need a cultural shift. That is about we can reshape and reprogram our economies. And then, of course, the next steps are for governments to act. I mean, they know what they have to do, so to act. And for us and for citizens, I think, is to start this conversation. Start to, even in your families or with friends, start discussing about the impact of economies, inequality, and climate change on your life. And then I would say join movements and join organizations, community organizations that work to make change in your own context, and ask your local politicians, for example, your mayor, what is the impact of climate change on our town? What is the impact of inequality? What are you doing to do that? And of course, as Earth for All, we are going to publish the book in September. We hope it can be a useful tool for everybody, and everybody can join Earth for All. You just need to go to the website, which is earthforall.life, and take. You will have a number of actions and things like that. But overall, Earth for All is an amplifier of all the good things that are already happening. And I just want to close by saying something that, as Sandrine was saying, is about collective action. So you need both the governments, you need the business communities, and you need citizens. So, yeah.
So, Luca, thank you. And how do you think the Earth for All report, it will be published in full in September, and we have a new climate meeting in November in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. How do you think this report can have calls for actions and play into what's going to happen in Egypt?
So the first thing, again, as Sandrine was saying, I think in Egypt we need to go beyond pledges, and we need to have action. So I think there's an entire kind of climate architecture should need to get a boost in Egypt. But I think for us, what is important is that the issue of reshaping our economies, reprogramming our economies will be important in that kind of setting. Yeah.
So, in all, to conclude here, you could all join the Earth for All platform.
Yeah, you go to the website, you will see actions, you just leave your email, you will be contacted, there's option to join, and yeah.
And are there local offices, local communities to sort of meet people to?
No, that's an interesting question. No, it's an open campaign. Well, that's interesting. So basically, everybody can join. Everybody can kind of bring the message on, and the message work if it's useful. So I mean, it's everybody can use it. It's like the power of ideas. So we hope the message is strong enough for people to bring it with their own politicians in their own communities.
So if you want to create a group in your office, in your company, or in your community?
If you want to have a conversation, for example, all the students in the world, if they want to have a conversation in their universities with, the economy, studying economics, or in the municipality or citizen assemblies, they can do it. It's a good starter for having good conversations. So there's a number, of course, you can think about questions, how to trigger these questions and conversations.
So it's an excellent tool.
I hope so. We hope so. Yeah.
It indeed sounds like it's an excellent tool for action and for transformation of this planet that we call home. Well, thank you so much, Luca.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank all of the speakers, previous speakers on this segment. It's fantastic. So this concludes this session here on that we call Power to the People. It is indeed Power to the People. And we move on to the next session. It's called Let the Gap Be Your Map, Circularity Reach Climate Goals. And that starts in a little bit, so just hang in there. Thank you.
So, welcome to this session, which, as Catarina mentioned, is called Let the Gap Be Your Map. And I'll leave the floor, or I'll introduce to the floor, Ellen Larsen, the current Program Director for Resource, who will introduce and explain the theme of this next hour. Welcome. Very nice to see you.
Thank you.
If you want to take a slot here.
I'll take a slot here.
It's all yours.
Thank you. A warm welcome to our session, Let the Gap Be Your Map. So, Resource is a Swedish strategic innovation program that's funded by the Swedish energy agency, Vinnova and Formas. Our vision is to create a sustainable use of materials within the planetary boundaries. And the main focus of our work is to fund innovation projects and as well as projects gathering new facts to create knowledge. How we use materials has a huge impact on the planet. Resource extraction and processing accounts for almost 50% of the global carbon dioxide emissions and almost 90% of the loss of biodiversity. IPCC was able to state for the first time in its report in April this year that circular materials flows are a prerequisite for the industry to achieve its ambitions to fulfill the Paris Agreement. But to address circularity in the right way, we need to know where we stand today and to be able to measure change over time. And that's why Resource decided to fund the Circularity Gap Report for Sweden, so that we have a reference value. We are living in a complex world. We are dealing with complex questions, and those needs to be simplified so that they are easier to comprehend, so that we can get everyone on board and get everyone moving in the same directions. I recently listened to a PhD and a psychologist that talked about transformation and what it takes to create change. They said that 40 to 50% of change can come from being able to choose a different product or a different service. But the rest is up to us and our ability to change. And for that, we might need a common vision to understand what that new life could look like. And that's also something that is described in the Circularity Gap Report that states 6 future scenarios for different sectors that challenge the status quo. One interesting point that was also made out by the two is that we need to allow people to have the sense of loss of what might be taken away from them in this new world, and let people grieve that loss. It's time for a new kind of leadership, a leadership that is curious, brave, but also humble. So let's start this session with having a look at this short introduction film to the Circularity Gap Report, Sweden.
Well, that was super. Thank you very much indeed, Ellen. We're now going to go over to Matthew Fraser of the Circle Economy. I came across the Circle Economy a couple of years ago. They're